Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you're watching this webinar. Again, this is Dave Nagel. I'm very excited to share the last in the series of a four-part webinar series with my good friends and colleagues from Yelm Community Schools, which I will really have been really excited to meet a lot of you for the first time next week after Thanksgiving. And for some, looking forward to seeing some old friends. We're going to jump right in to this last one on Mindframes. And one of the things John Hattie talks about is that all of us come into the profession of education with our mind made up possibly on the best way to fill in the blank. Teach sixth grade, teach seventh grade English, teach high school biology, become an administrator. And as long as those beliefs go unchecked, they become solidified as the way we think we should do business. And they really sometimes need a jolt or a shift or a change in the narrative because our beliefs are really what underpin everything that we do. And certainly there are plenty of studies around this, and sometimes it's not a study, but it's just common sense that our perceptions and beliefs are the most significant predictors of change. So we're going to dig into what John Hattie calls the mind frames. And so by the end of this webinar, you'll be able to determine some of the actions that would align John Hattie's mind frames, those beliefs that underpin everything we do in our schools and all of our Yelm classrooms. And you have just a little bit of a part of the working handout that I'm going to just kind of guide you through. And this is one where I'll kind of pause briefly after each short piece. Let you jot down some notes and ideas for those of you that have access to the Visible Learning for Teachers book. I would highly recommend if you dig into chapter 9, there's a strong piece there around the mind frames, beginning on page 169. For those of you, I will bring a couple copies of the book when I'm there next week. And I know Lisa and Brian have actually, I know they've got some on hand, so you could certainly get your hands on some of those if you wanted to read deeper about each one of these. So it's kind of a culmination of studies, but we can take teachers off and put humans. We're more likely to embrace evidence that supports our existing orientations than evidence that contradicts it. And one of the examples I often use is that if you're really excited to go to a restaurant, you've wanted to go to this restaurant, and you've been thinking about it, and you go to Yelp and you see that there are 9 reviews and 7 of them are positive, only 2 are negative. There's a pretty good chance you're going to put more of the weight on those positive reviews versus the negative ones. But what if those 2 negative reviews were that people died of botulism there? So sometimes we have to be careful about the evidence that we're pulling in that validates our existing beliefs versus those that might challenge them, and what's the weight of that evidence? So the first mind frame that Hattie came up with, which is really the culminating one, is that I am an evaluator. And every one of us is an evaluator, not an evaluator of anyone else, not the evaluation process that we sometimes think of. But our job is to evaluate our impact, the impact our actions are having on the learning of the students that we serve. And so as a classroom teacher, that's the students you have in your classroom on a daily basis. As an administrator, that's the students that you're serving in your entire school, which you work through your teachers to get there, from the central office and Brian and Lisa's positions and others. It's how you work through administrators into the teachers and down to the students. But every one of us is an evaluator. And really what Hattie would say is then he spent the rest of the mind frames describing how he lived out that first one. We talk about learning, not teaching. And I sometimes go to the PLC example here where we can come to a PLC meeting and talk about this great lesson that we did. We focus on our actions and maybe less on the impact of learning that we were looking for in student work and student behaviors. One that has always challenged me to some degree and usually challenges a lot of the audiences I work with is assessment is feedback to me. The only reason why we should assess students is so it tells us what to do. We're assessing to diagnose. When we're taking a staff survey to know how teachers feel about relational trust or safety or anything, it's feedback for us as administrators, but assessment is feedback for me. It's not to grade the students. It's not to evaluate the teachers. It's for me as the leader of that classroom or the leader of that school to get evidence to know how to drive my actions. I love the mind frame being called a change agent. And there's a lot of elements go into it, but 2 that really kind of stand out is number 1, I will not lament. Now that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge challenges, to say that poverty doesn't matter, that socioeconomic status or sometimes race or ethnicity or student being mobile doesn't matter. That's simply just not true. And we can't pretend like those things don't matter. But obviously they're not the only factor because we know students that have had many challenges and have done very, very well. What was impactful was the teaching practices. At the same time, one of the other things that a change agent will do is they will innovate. Now, innovation doesn't mean that we have to plug it in. Innovation simply means that we're going to do whatever is necessary for our actions to get the best results with our students, being a change agent. I engage in dialogue, not monologue. Do we listen more than we talk? I know this is one that I have to work on consistently. I like to talk. I like to hear myself talk. Sometimes I wait for others to finish so I can talk. But are we listening to our students? Are we listening to our staff? How can we be more intentional? One of the strategies that I talk about, got it from the book, The Multiplier Effect from Kim Wiseman. Play fewer chips. At a staff meeting, at a PLC meeting, in a classroom, be more inclined to be okay with the uncomfortable silence. Don't be the one that has to fill the air with all of the thoughts in your head or deliver all the information. To help students develop the ability to have deep discussions and not just focus on questioning individually. We enjoy and embrace the challenge. We don't break a task down to make it easier. We scaffold sometimes, but we enjoy the challenge of learning. We enjoy the challenge and the hurdle, which means sometimes we have to get better, in fact, a lot of the time, at making sure that time is the variable and learning is the constant. We develop positive relationships with others, and the reason why we develop positive relationships with our students or with our staff members is simply so that they can be more comfortable making mistakes. The more comfortable I am with someone, the more I'm going to be inclined to make mistakes, and I'm going to feel safe making those mistakes. We use a shared language of learning. Now, there's a lot of elements within this, and sometimes when you read about it initially, it talks about getting outside the school and getting to the parents, and certainly while that's important, but a shared language of learning within the school. And so if we think within the English department, let's just talk about that at Yelm High School. If we're calling brainstorming in one classroom and pre-writing in another and jot listing in another, students are thinking of three different things. Do we have common vocabulary that we use? Do we have a common agreement of proficiency and mastery? And certainly grading and those things come into play, but a common understanding of assessment literacy. And then, of course, that has to expand out into our community. But I often go to a very easy example, but it's one that's kind of hard to argue with. I guarantee the varsity football coach uses the same cadence and blocking scheme with all of his players at the varsity, JV, freshman level. And why? Because that's the same program. And we don't want to have to reteach things or confuse our learners. At the athletic level, same concept needs to come into play when we're talking with our English or math, or as a school when we're talking about mastery, proficiency, what it means to be a good learner. And then, of course, as much as we can, communicate and try and live that out with our parents. We see learning as hard work. And we embrace that learning is hard work. It's not designed to be easy. It's hard sometimes. And there's three actions that we need to cultivate: concentration, perseverance, and deliberate practice. How do we embrace deliberate practice in our classroom? Are we set up to allow students to have enough time to really, really get things right and realize no way in the world will every learner need the same number of those practices? And then the last one Hattie has come up with in the last couple of years is that I collaborate, and I kind of joke, and I even send this to John. It's kind of hard to collaborate with myself, but his point is that I try to collaborate with others, and I look to collaborate with my peers because I know I have something to give. I have an idea, a strategy that might benefit students I won't come into contact with, but my peers will, and I can learn from them. So I'm collaborating because I want to learn and grow and share because we are all accountable and we own the learning for all of our students. So again, I went through that kind of fast. I try to do this one a little bit quick. If you have the opportunity to go back and you want to pause and maybe jot some ideas down, but again, I'm going to really encourage Chapter 9 in the Visible Learning for Teachers book, starting on page 169. Hattie goes deeper into each one of these mind frames. So again, hopefully we go back to our success criteria that you can describe some actions that would align to those mind frames. We're going to talk about these in more detail when we come together next week after the holiday. In terms of how we can maybe determine what are two or three that maybe as a district, maybe as a Yelm community school system that we're going to really focus on in the next year, or as a school, we're going to pick out two or three and really try to live them out, because these aren't things that we can just say. And they do challenge us. They do challenge existing beliefs, and it's hard to live every one of them out all the time. So, as always, I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you before I get to meet some of you personally. And for my friends and colleagues that I've had the pleasure of meeting already, I still look forward to seeing you next week, Tuesday and Wednesday after the holiday season of Thanksgiving. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you on the 29th of November. I had to get that date set. Have a great rest of your day.